The problem with eternity was its appalling lack of texture. King Kaelen, sovereign of the shadowed realm and lord of all that slumbered under the cold moon, had come to experience time as a great, placid lake. Centuries rippled and passed, but the water remained the same depth, the same chilling temperature. He had outlasted empires, watched mountains grind to dust, and tasted every conceivable vintage of wine and blood. The result was a boredom so profound it had become a physical weight, a shroud of ennui he wore more consistently than his crown. His court was a stagnant collection of ancient predators, their intrigues as predictable as the tides. They feared him, of course. His power was absolute, a thing of myth even to his own kind. But fear was a dull instrument, and he was a musician who had forgotten how to play. Then came Captain Rhys. She was the newest commander of the Crimson Guard, the elite corps of mortals who, for reasons of immense fortune or immense desperation, swore their fleeting lives to the protection of the eternal throne. Kaelen had not even bothered to attend the ceremony of her appointment, another forgettable face in a parade of them. He first saw her in the Hall of Echoes, standing sentinel by the obsidian throne while he dispensed some tedious judgment upon a squabbling pair of provincial lords. He had expected the usual stance, ramrod straight, eyes fixed on the middle distance, a statue carved from fear and duty. Rhys was different. She was alert, her gaze sweeping the hall with an unnerving, predatory stillness. Her body was coiled, not with tension, but with readiness. She was a panther in a room of peacocks. And when his gaze met hers, she did not flinch or look away. She held it for a beat too long, a flicker of something that was not deference assessment, perhaps, or even a sliver of defiance, before her eyes continued their sweep. She was young, by mortal standards. Her hair was a practical knot of dark brown, and her face, unadorned and severe, was a tapestry of faint scars and resolute angles. But her eyes were ancient. They held the weary, cynical light of someone who had seen the worst of the world and was entirely unimpressed by it. Later that evening, in the quiet solitude of his observatory, he was tracing the slow, cold dance of the constellations when she entered. Her footsteps were nearly silent on the marble floor. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice was a low contralto, a sound like gravel and honey. "The council awaits your presence for the final seal." He did not turn. "Let them wait," he murmured, his fingers ghosting over the celestial charts. "They have existed for 500 years. Another hour will not turn them to dust." A beat of silence. He expected an immediate, subservient retreat. Instead, he heard her shift her weight. "With respect, Your Majesty, Lord Vorna is threatening to have the cartographer flayed for his impertinent use of parchment. An hour might, in fact, turn him to dust." Kaelen finally turned. He arched a single, perfect eyebrow. The expression was a carefully cultivated tool, one that had made generals tremble and ancient vampires bow their heads. It had no discernible effect on Captain Rhys. She stood with her arms clasped behind her back, her expression one of weary patience. "You find Lord Vorna's temperament amusing, Captain?" he asked, his voice a silken threat. "I find it predictable," she replied, her tone perfectly even. "And a waste of a good cartographer. They're surprisingly hard to replace." The sheer, unadorned honesty of it struck him. She wasn't being insolent, not precisely. She was being practical. She was stating a fact as she saw it, without the customary layers of flattery and terror that usually coated every word addressed to him. A strange, unfamiliar sensation fluttered in the barren landscape of his chest. It was interest. A genuine, prickling curiosity. "And you believe my presence will soothe her?" he pressed, stepping down from the dais. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly soundless, a predator's glide. He stopped before her, close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from her skin, to smell the clean, metallic scent of her polished armor and the living, breathing human beneath it. Her heartbeat was a steady, unhurried rhythm in the vast silence of the room. It did not accelerate as he drew near. "I believe your presence will remind her that you are the king," Rhys said, her gaze unwavering, "and that the castle's staff are your property to manage or mismanage, as you see fit." There it was again. That dry, cutting wit, delivered with the bland professionalism of a field report. A smile, the first real one in a decade, threatened to breach his lips. He suppressed it, turning it into a thoughtful frown. An interesting perspective, Captain. He swept past her, the edge of his velvet cloak brushing against her arm. He felt the jolt of it, a spark of warmth in his cold existence. As he walked toward the council chambers, he felt the ghost of that smile linger. Predictable. She had called his court predictable. She was right. But she, he suspected, was anything but. And in the vast, still waters of his eternal boredom, Kaelen felt the first, faint ripple of a new and dangerous tide. An idea began to form, a game to be played. He wanted to see more of that coiled readiness, that unimpressed gaze. He wanted to test the limits of her flawless, infuriating competence. For the first time in centuries, the king was looking forward to tomorrow. The next week was an exercise in subtle observation. Kaelen watched Rhys from a distance, studying her rhythms, her unwavering vigilance. She was a creature of profound discipline. She moved through the Gothic grandeur of his castle not with awe, but with a brisk, tactical assessment. She saw vulnerabilities where his architects had seen beauty. A sweeping balcony was a sniper's perch, an ornate tapestry, a hiding place for an assassin. She saw his world not as a home, but as a battlefield. Her presence was a constant, quiet hum of energy in the stagnant air of the court, and he found himself drawn to it, a moth to a mortal flame. He decided the game would begin in the western catacombs. It was a section of the castle that had been sealed for centuries, a relic of a more paranoid, less civilized age. It was rumored to be riddled with the crude, mechanical traps of his ancestors, pressure plates, scything blades, dart launchers. The official histories claimed they had all been deactivated during the Great Pacification 300 years ago. Kaelen knew for a fact that several had been deliberately overlooked. "I wish to view the sepulchre of King Malika," he announced one afternoon, his tone one of regal caprice. Vorna, ever at his side, had looked momentarily surprised. "Your Majesty, the western wing is unstable. It is a place of dust and memory. Surely the royal crypts are more fitting," she'd countered, her voice smooth as aged wine. "I am weary of fitting places, Vorna," he had replied, already moving. "I have a sudden desire for dust and memory. Captain Rhys, you will accompany me." He saw the flicker in Rhys's eyes as he said it. Not fear, but a sharpening of her focus. She gave a short, clipped nod. "As you command." He led the way, carrying a single, ornate lantern that cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the stone walls. The air grew cold and thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Rhys followed 3 paces behind him, her boots making soft, deliberate sounds on the uneven floor. He could feel her attention on his back, a palpable weight. She was scanning everything, the ceiling, the walls, the very flagstones beneath their feet. He had to hide a smile. She was already expecting trouble. Good. They passed through a series of crumbling antechambers, the silence broken only by the drip of water and the scuttling of unseen things. "My great-great-grandsire was a theatrical man," Kaelen remarked, his voice echoing in the oppressive quiet. "He believed a king's tomb should be as well defended as his throne room. A rather sentimental notion." "A practical one," Rhys corrected from behind him. "The dead can't protect their own gold." He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "You have a gift for stripping the romance from any occasion, Captain." "It's a living," she said flatly. They entered a long, narrow corridor. The air was unnaturally still. Kaelen, with his ancient senses, could feel the subtle tension in the air, the faint metallic taste of oiled springs and weighting mechanisms. He knew precisely where the pressure plate was, a slightly discolored stone 3 feet ahead. It was connected to a pair of massive, scythe-like blades hidden in the walls, designed to swing out and meet at chest height. It was, he had to admit, brutally effective. He slowed his pace, feigning a sudden interest in the carvings on the wall. "Remarkable," he murmured, tracing a faded glyph with one finger. The artistry of the Third Dynasty was so visceral he took a half-step back, then, with a performance of sublime clumsiness, he pretended to lose his footing. He stumbled forward, his arms flailing for balance, his entire body lurching directly toward the trigger stone. He allowed a look of wide-eyed, aristocratic surprise to cross his features. For a split second, he saw the scene from her perspective. The king, a creature of impossible grace, suddenly rendered as clumsy as a newborn foal, about to impale himself on his own history. The world exploded in motion. Rhys did not shout a warning. She did not hesitate. She moved with a speed that was almost supernatural for a mortal, a blur of dark leather and steel. She covered the distance between them in a single, powerful lunge, her body hitting his with the force of a battering ram. The impact drove the air from his lungs, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a millennium. They crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs, his velvet cloak billowing around them. He landed on his back with her sprawled on top of him, her body a shield over his. The sound was deafening. A grinding clang of metal on metal echoed through the corridor as the twin scythes sliced through the space where his chest had been a second before. They met with a shower of sparks, their ancient edges still lethally sharp, quivering inches from Rhys's head. Dust and stone fragments rained down on them. For a moment, there was only the sound of the blades humming in the sudden silence and Rhys's ragged breathing next to his ear. The warmth of her, the solid, living weight of her, was a startling reality. He could feel the frantic, powerful thrum of her heart against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against his own still, silent chest. The scent of her was overwhelming: sweat, leather, and the sweet, intoxicating copper of her own blood, a small cut on her cheek from a flying stone chip. She pushed herself up, bracing her hands on his shoulders. Her face was inches from his, her eyes blazing with a cold, white-hot fury. "With respect, Your Majesty," she snarled, her voice a low, dangerous growl that vibrated through his entire body. "Are you blind or just suicidal?" He simply looked at her, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the smudge of dirt on her jaw, the tiny bead of blood on her cheekbone. The dust motes danced in the lantern light around her head like a chaotic halo. The game had worked even better than he had imagined. The rush of it, the proximity, the raw, unfiltered anger directed at him, it was intoxicating. It was the most alive he had felt in 500 years. He did not smile. He did not dare. He merely held her furious gaze and felt the ancient, placid lake of his soul stir into a storm. The incident in the catacombs set a new tone for their interactions. Rhys's vigilance, already formidable, became something akin to a physical presence. She watched him with an intensity that was both professional and deeply personal, as if she suspected him of being a danger primarily to himself. He found it endlessly entertaining. He had spent millennia being viewed as an untouchable predator, a force of nature. To be treated like a precious, breakable, and profoundly stupid object was a novelty of the highest order. So, naturally, he decided to escalate. A clumsy stumble was one thing. An assassination attempt was another. It required more planning, more artistry. He selected his assassin with care, a young, foppish vampire named Lucian, whose primary vices were gambling and vanity. Lucian owed a significant debt to one of Kaelen's financial agents, making him both malleable and desperate. Kaelen summoned him to a private chamber, the air thick with the scent of old books and unspoken power. Lucian knelt, trembling, clearly expecting to lose a limb, or at least his inheritance. Kaelen circled him slowly. "Lord Lucian," he began, his voice a soft purr, "I have a task for you. A performance, if you will." He laid out the plan. During the afternoon promenade on the northern battlements, Lucian would stage an attack. He would be provided with a crossbow, a handsome, well-crafted weapon. Kaelen even allowed him to choose it from the royal armory. The bolt, however, would be a special commission, a solid steel shaft with a blunted tip, wrapped in just enough silver filigree to catch the light and look menacing. It would hit with the force of a thrown rock, painful, certainly, but hardly lethal to a being like Kaelen. In return for his theatrical outburst, Lucian's debts would be erased, and a generous stipend would be settled upon him, provided he could spend the next year in a distant, comfortable exile. Lucian, seeing a way out of his troubles, agreed with wide-eyed, sycophantic fervor. The day was perfect for it. A pale, watery sun hung in the sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the courtyard below. Kaelen walked the stone parapet, feigning a deep interest in the training of the new guard recruits below. Rhys was at his side, her gaze not on the courtyard, but on the rooftops, the shadowed archways, the faces of the courtiers who drifted nearby. She was a study in coiled tension. The new recruits lack discipline, Kaelen commented idly, leaning against the Merlin. Their footwork is atrocious. They're 16, Your Majesty, Rhys said without looking at him. Their footwork is the least of their problems. That one, she nodded subtly to the left, has his greaves on backward. Kaelen almost laughed. He loved that about her, the complete absence of romanticism. He saw history and grandeur, she saw tactical flaws and shoddy equipment. It was then that Lucian made his move. He burst from a nearby turret doorway, his face a mask of practiced rage. "Tyrant," he screamed, his voice cracking with a bit too much melodrama. "Your reign of stagnation ends today." He raised the crossbow, the silver-tipped bolt glinting in the pale sunlight. The court gasped. Guards fumbled for their swords. For his part, Kaelen arranged his features into a mask of regal shock, widening his eyes just so. He even allowed himself a small, vulnerable step backward, as if truly caught off guard. He turned his head, watching Rhys from the corner of his eye. She was already a blur. Before Lucian could even properly aim, she had crossed the 10 feet between them. One hand struck the crossbow, sending it flying over the battlements to clatter on the stones below. Her other hand seized Lucian's wrist, twisting it at an angle that made the young vampire cry out in pain. In the next fluid motion, she spun him around, slammed him face-first into the stone wall, and had a silver-laced dagger pressed against his throat. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. It was a masterpiece of violent efficiency. The battlements were silent, save for Lucian's pathetic whimpering. Rhys held him there for a moment, her breath not even quickened, before 2 of her guards rushed forward to drag the assassin away. She didn't watch them go. Her attention snapped back to Kaelen. Her eyes were chips of flint. She strode toward him, closing the distance until she had him backed against the cold stone of the parapet. She wasn't touching him, but he felt pinned by the sheer force of her presence. Her hands came up, not in deference, but to pat him down, checking for injuries he could not possibly have sustained. The search was rough, impersonal, and yet breathtakingly intimate. Her fingers brushed his chest, his arms, his sides, a frantic, proprietary assessment. When she was satisfied he was unharmed, she planted her hands on the wall on either side of his head, caging him in. Her face was close, her eyes blazing with a fury that made her previous anger in the catacombs seem like mild irritation. "All right, that's it," she hissed, her voice a low, vibrating snarl that was for his ears alone. "I'm done. Are you trying to get killed, or are you just an idiot?" He stared into her furious eyes, at the pulse beating in her throat, the fierce line of her mouth. He could feel the warmth of her body, smell the scent of righteous anger coming off her like a perfume. This was 1,000 times better than the catacombs. This was a raw, unfiltered emotion she would never dare show anyone else, an intimacy born of exasperation and a fierce, unwilling protectiveness. All the air in the world couldn't fill his lungs. In that moment, caged between her arms, with the entire court watching, the ancient, bored vampire king realized he was, irrevocably and inconveniently, falling in love. Just over her shoulder, he saw Lady Vorna. She stood apart from the gawking crowd, her expression a careful, unreadable mask. But he knew how to read the subtle tightening of her lips, the cold glint in her eyes. She was not seeing a king amused by his guardian's spirit. She was seeing a king cornered by a mortal, his authority challenged, his focus diverted. She was seeing weakness. And Kaelen, lost in the fire of Rhys's gaze, failed to recognize the danger in Vorna's. He was so captivated by his game that he didn't realize another, far more deadly one, was already in play. In the weeks that followed, Kaelen found the desire for his dangerous games waning. The thrill of manufactured chaos felt cheap and hollow compared to the quiet, complex tension that now hummed between him and his captain. He ceased his accidents, content instead to simply observe her, to create opportunities for them to exist in the same space. The grand, echoing halls of the castle began to feel less like a prison and more like a stage for a subtle, two-person play. He took to spending his evenings in the royal library, a cavernous, multi-tiered rotunda where the silence was so profound you could hear the dust settling on forgotten philosophies. He would sit by the fire, a tome of ancient poetry open but unread in his lap, and wait. Inevitably, Rhys would appear, a silent shadow by the doorway, her presence a silent announcement that she was assuming the night watch. For the first few nights, they sat in silence, separated by 20 yards of polished marble and a chasm of rank. One night, as she stood sentinel, her gaze fixed on the towering, moonlit windows, he finally spoke into the quiet. "It is a lonely duty, is it not? To watch while others sleep." She didn't turn, but he saw her shoulders tense slightly. "The pay is good," she said, her voice flat. "No mortal pays this well, Captain," he countered softly. "The Crimson Guard's charter promises wealth beyond measure, but it demands a life. No one sells their life for mere gold. What is it you are truly buying?" The silence stretched. He thought she wouldn't answer. He watched the firelight flicker across the spines of 1,000 leather-bound books, each one a life, a story, condensed to ink and parchment. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, directed at the window rather than at him. "My sister," she said. "She has the lung fever. The kind that eats you from the inside out. The healers in our village use leeches and prayer. The physicians in the capital, the ones who can actually make a difference, require a king's ransom." She paused, and he could hear the carefully controlled emotion in her throat. "My contract pays for them. It buys her time. It buys her breath." The simple, devastating honesty of it silenced him. He, who had lived 10,000 lives, had forgotten the brutal calculus of one. He saw her then, not as a fascinating puzzle or an object of his affection, but as a woman bound by a fierce, desperate love. It was a love so powerful she would stand guard over a monster in a dying castle to keep it alive. "She must be very proud of you," he said, the words feeling inadequate, small. Rhys finally turned to look at him. In the flickering firelight, the hard edges of her face seemed to soften. "She thinks I'm a quartermaster for a merchant lord in the south," she said, a ghost of a wry smile touching her lips. "It's better that way." A fragile bridge had been built across the chasm between them. He found himself wanting to share something in return, a piece of himself not shrouded in myth or power. "I had a brother once," he found himself saying, the memory rising unbidden, a fossil from the deep strata of his past. He loved to watch the stars. He believed that each one was the soul of a fallen king. Watching over his descendants, he looked up, toward the high, arching ceiling of the library. "He died of a fever, not so different from your sister's. I was a boy. It was 2,000 years ago." He said it simply, a statement of fact, but he felt the weight of it, the sheer, crushing scale of the time that had passed. He felt Rhys's gaze on him, and for the first time, he saw not vigilance or anger, but a flicker of something else. Understanding. Perhaps even a sliver of pity. She saw, in that moment, not the immortal king, but the boy who had lost his brother and had been losing pieces of himself to time ever since. They spoke no more that night, but the silence was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of their shared vulnerabilities. He noticed the small things about her, a tiny, silver locket she wore tucked beneath her gorget, the way she would unconsciously rub a faint scar on the back of her left hand when she was deep in thought. And she, in turn, began to see past the crown. She saw the profound weariness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, the way his hands, unnaturally still, always seemed to be restraining an immense, ancient power. This new, quiet intimacy was a far greater threat to the court's stability than any of Kaelen's theatrical games had been. The games were a spectacle, the predictable eccentricity of an all-powerful ruler. But this quiet camaraderie, these shared silences in the library, this looked like influence. Lady Vorna, in particular, watched with a cold, calculating eye. She saw a human worming her way into the king's confidence, her mortal fragility a contagion spreading through the heart of their eternal world. The king was no longer playing. He was changing. And to Vorna, who had built her power on the bedrock of his unchanging nature, change was the one sin that could not be forgiven. She began to whisper in the shadowed alcoves of the court, her words seeds of dissent planted in the fertile ground of fear and ambition. The king was compromised. The king was weak. The throne was, perhaps, becoming vulnerable. Lady Vorna moved through the shadowed corridors of Kaelen's court like a disease of the blood, silent and purposeful. From Kaelen's perspective, she was a fixture, a polished and unyielding piece of his eternal landscape. She had been his advisor for 7 centuries, her counsel as sharp and reliable as obsidian. He had come to rely on her efficiency, her dispassionate analysis, mistaking her lack of sentiment for loyalty. He failed to see the ambition that burned behind her cool, grey eyes, a fire banked for centuries, waiting for the right breeze to fan it into a conflagration. From her own perspective, Vorna was not a traitor, she was a purist. She remembered the old ways, the glorious, blood-soaked nights when their kind did not hide in Gothic castles but ruled the darkness as gods. Kaelen's reign, in her eyes, had been one of slow, decadent decay. He had traded conquest for aesthetics, terror for order. He had allowed their power to stagnate, to become a story whispered by mortals rather than a truth screamed by them. And this new obsession, this fascination with a mortal soldier, was the final, unforgivable symptom of his decline. She saw him in the library, his gaze fixed on the human guard, an expression on his ancient face she hadn't seen in centuries, not power, not command, but a kind of wistful longing. He was captivated by a creature whose heart would beat its last before the castle's oldest tapestries had faded another shade. It was, to Vorna, a profound sickness of the soul. A king who could be so thoroughly distracted by a gnat was no longer fit to command a nation of lions. Her coup was not just a grab for power, she framed it in her own mind as a necessary amputation, a cutting away of the rot to save the whole. She began her work in the places Kaelen no longer frequented, the sparring chambers where younger, more restless vampires honed their skills, the crypts where old, conservative families paid homage to their sires, the wine cellars where grievances were aired over goblets of crimson. Her words were carefully chosen, venom dipped in honey. To Lord Valerus, a warrior whose glory days were long past, she spoke of honor. Do you see how he allows that human to speak to him? She corners him on the battlements, and he does nothing. The Crimson Guard was meant to be our shield, not our master. He shames the throne. To the matron of the House of Cyrillus, a schemer who felt her family had been overlooked, she spoke of legacy. He has no heir. He shows no interest in securing the bloodline. Instead, he spends his nights in the company of a common mortal. What becomes of us when his fleeting amusement ends? Who will rule then? To the younger, ambitious ones, she spoke of the future. He is content with this, stasis. He clings to treaties and accords. The mortal world grows, changes, while we wither in our fortress of memories. We should be feasting on their progress, not hiding from it. A new age requires a new monarch. She used Kaelen's own games against him. The accident in the catacombs became a sign of his carelessness, his disregard for his own sacred life. The assassination on the battlements was proof of his weakness, his inability to control even the feckless youth of his own court. His quiet moments with Rhys were twisted into evidence of a mortal's insidious control over his mind. The announcement of the annual Grand Masquerade provided her with the perfect stage. It was the one night of the year when the court's rigid protocols were relaxed, when masks offered anonymity and the celebratory atmosphere could easily mask the first moments of a rebellion. It was a tradition Kaelen upheld out of sheer inertia, another predictable ritual in his endless calendar. Vorna saw it as a divine opportunity. She planned every detail with chilling precision. Her loyalists would wear a specific marker, a raven's feather tucked into their costume. The castle guard rotations would be altered, placing those loyal to her at key positions, the main gates, the armory, the king's own chambers. The string quartet was bribed to play a specific, discordant chord as the signal to strike. The attack would be overwhelming, designed to succeed before Kaelen could rally his personal power. One evening, just days before the ball, Kaelen was walking with Rhys through the moon-drenched gardens. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. He was telling her a story about the constellations, a myth from a forgotten human tribe he'd known long ago. He felt relaxed, at ease, the crushing weight of his crown momentarily forgotten. As they rounded a sculpted hedge, they saw Vorna, standing by a fountain, speaking in low tones with Lord Valerus. When she saw them, she fell silent, offering Kaelen a deep, respectful bow. Valerus did the same. "Your Majesty," Vorna said, her voice smooth as polished marble. We were just discussing the final preparations for the masquerade. It will be a night to remember. I am sure it will be, Vorna, Kaelen replied, oblivious. He glanced at Rhys, a small, private smile on his lips, before continuing their walk. He did not see the look that passed between Vorna and Valerus. A look of shared purpose, of cold, final resolve. The audience knew the danger, the web of treason being woven around the oblivious king. Kaelen, lost in the simple pleasure of a shared moment with the woman who had inadvertently woken him from his slumber, saw only the stars. He was so focused on the one, bright, burning light of his new fascination that he failed to notice the encroaching darkness all around him. The night of the grand masquerade arrived on a wave of chilled air and silver moonlight. The great hall had been transformed. Thousands of candles floated in the enchanted air, their light glinting off crystal goblets and the polished obsidian floor, making the entire chamber look like a captured piece of the night sky. The scent of beeswax, expensive perfume, and night-blooming moon-petal flowers hung heavy in the air. A string quartet, perched on a balcony draped in black velvet, played a waltz that was both haunting and beautiful, a perfect soundtrack for the court of the eternally damned. The guests were a river of silk, satin, and shadow. Their costumes were elaborate, fantastical creations, beasts of myth, forgotten gods, personifications of vice and virtue. Behind masks of porcelain, leather, and precious metal, ancient eyes watched with predatory stillness. It was a beautiful, dangerous illusion, a civilized veneer over a room full of monsters. Kaelen, by tradition, wore no mask. His face, more striking and severe than any artifice, was his own. He stood on the dais, observing the spectacle with a familiar sense of detachment. But this year, it was different. This year, Rhys stood at his side, and her presence changed the texture of the entire evening. She wore her immaculate crimson guard uniform, the dark red a stark slash of color against the swirling blacks and silvers of the ball. A simple, black domino mask covered her eyes, but it did little to conceal her sharp, assessing gaze as it swept the room, missing nothing. "You look entirely out of place, Captain," Kaelen murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear over the music. "That's the point of a guard, Your Majesty," she replied without turning her head. "To not blend in." "A pity," he said, a genuine note of regret in his voice. "The music is quite lovely. It would be a shame to let it go to waste." He extended a hand to her. "Dance with me." Rhys froze. Her head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with shock behind her mask. "Your Majesty, I am on duty. It would be a dereliction." "I am the king," he interrupted softly, his hand still extended. "I am relieving you of your duty for the duration of one waltz." "That is an order, Captain." He saw the conflict in her posture, the rigid set of her shoulders warring with the undeniable command. For a moment, he thought she would refuse. Then, with a sigh that was pure exasperation, she placed her gloved hand in his. Her grip was firm, professional. He led her down from the dais and onto the dance floor. The other dancers parted before them like a receding tide, clearing a space in the center of the hall. The quartet, seeing the king, seamlessly transitioned into a slower, more melancholic piece. Kaelen pulled her into the formal posture of the waltz. Her body was stiff, her movements clipped and awkward. She was trying to dance while simultaneously scanning the room for threats, a hopeless division of focus. "Breathe, Rhys," he whispered, his lips close to her ear. He used her given name for the first time, a deliberate intimacy. He felt her shudder slightly. "For the next 3 minutes, the only threat you need to worry about is my left foot. I confess, a little out of practice." A small, choked sound that might have been a laugh escaped her. "Somehow I doubt that." "Trust me," he said, and began to lead. He moved with the fluid, effortless grace that came from millennia of practice. He guided her through the steps, his hand firm on her back. Slowly, miraculously, she began to relax. The rigid lines of the soldier softened. Her steps began to match his. She stopped scanning the crowd and finally, hesitantly, met his gaze. The world fell away. There was only the music, the candlelight, and the astonishing, unguarded intensity in her eyes. The mask hid her identity from the court, but here, in his arms, it felt as if all her barriers were gone. He saw not the cynical captain, but the woman who would sell her life for her sister. He saw the fire, the intelligence, the profound and weary strength that had so captivated him. In his long, long life, he had held empresses and goddesses in his arms. None of them had felt as real, as substantial, as the mortal soldier who was currently trying very hard not to step on his feet. A feeling he could only identify as peace settled over him. It was a profound, terrifying stillness. This, he realized, was what he had been searching for in his foolish, dangerous games. Not the thrill, not the adrenaline, but this. This connection. This breathtaking, horrifying, beautiful feeling of being truly seen. He was in love. The realization was not a thunderclap, but a quiet, absolute certainty that settled into the very marrow of his ancient bones. The final notes of the waltz hung in the air, shimmering, before fading into silence. They stood for a moment in the center of the floor, the court watching them in stunned silence. He did not want to let her go. But the moment was broken. Lady Varner glided toward them, a vision in silver and black, her mask a magnificent, cruel-looking hawk. "A beautiful dance, Your Majesty," she said, her voice a silken purr that slid like ice down Kaelen's spine. "You look happy." There was something in her tone, a finality, a predatory chill that cut through the warm haze of the moment. Kaelen looked into the dark, mirrored lenses of her mask and, for the first time, felt a genuine flicker of unease. Varner gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the musician's balcony. And then, the music stopped. Not with a fade, but with a sudden, screeching, discordant chord that ripped through the hall like a scream. It was the signal. The great oak doors at the end of the hall slammed shut with a deafening boom. The enchanted candles flickered and died, plunging the room into a terrifying gloom, lit only by the cold, blue moonlight slanting through the high windows. In the sudden, shocked silence, a new sound arose. The chilling, unmistakable whisper of steel being drawn from 100 hidden sheaths. The grand masquerade was over. The coup had begun. Chaos erupted in a heartbeat. The signal cord was still echoing in the vaulted ceiling when Varner's loyalists moved. They were a tide of black and silver, raven feathers stark against their costumes as they shed their festive facades to reveal the armor and weapons beneath. The attack was not a disorganized melee, it was a brutally efficient, coordinated strike. One group secured the doors, their swords forming a glittering, impassable wall. Another swarmed the royal dais, cutting off any retreat. The main force, led by Lord Valerus, surged toward the center of the room, their target singular and absolute, the king. Kaelen was frozen for a fraction of a second. Not by fear, he had not felt true fear in 2,000 years, but by the sheer, cold shock of the betrayal. Varner. His advisor. The one constant in his court for 700 years. The logic of it was so monstrous it momentarily defied comprehension. He saw her across the room, the hawk mask discarded, her face a pale, triumphant sneer in the moonlight. But his paralysis lasted only a moment, because Rhys was already in motion. The instant the doors slammed shut, she had released him, shoving him behind her as she dropped into a low, defensive crouch. There was no transition. The captain who had been stiff and uncertain in his arms just moments before was gone, replaced by a lethal predator. Twin blades, their edges laced with silver that gleamed hungrily in the gloom, seemed to materialize in her hands. The first of Varner's soldiers reached them, a hulking brute in a minotaur mask, his axe swinging in a deadly arc. Kaelen began to raise a hand, a flicker of shadow magic ready on his fingertips. He was too slow. Rhys moved like lightning. She didn't meet the axe head-on. She flowed under the swing, her body impossibly low to the ground. One blade slid upward, finding the gap between the vampire's gorget and breastplate with surgical precision. Her other blade slashed across the back of his knees. The vampire gave a choked cry and crumpled, his heavy armor clattering on the obsidian floor. She was a whirlwind. A dance far deadlier and more intricate than the waltz. Her movements were economical, precise, utterly without wasted energy. Every parry flowed into a riposte, every dodge into a strike. She fought not with the brute force of her opponents, but with a terrifying, intimate knowledge of their anatomy, her silver-laced blades seeking out the vulnerabilities in their armor, the seams in their defenses. She was a single, disciplined storm of steel in the heart of the chaos. Kaelen felt a surge of cold, black rage. This was real. The blood being spilled was real. The danger to Rhys was real. And it was his fault. His games, his blindness, his arrogant boredom had led them here. He had treated his own life as a toy, and now she was paying the price, bleeding for his folly. He saw Lord Valerus break through the fray, his massive broadsword raised high, aimed directly at Rhys's exposed back. The rage coalesced into power. Tendrils of pure darkness, cold and tangible, erupted from Kaelen's hands. They shot across the floor, faster than thought, wrapping around Valerus's ankles. The ancient warrior roared in surprise as he was yanked off his feet, crashing to the floor an inch before his sword could find its mark. Rhys spun, her eyes meeting Kaelen's for a split second. There was no time for words, but an understanding passed between them. She gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. He was no longer the asset to be protected, he was her partner in the fight. They fell into a natural, deadly rhythm, moving back to back. Her silver blades were a flashing, sunbright counterpoint to his creeping, moondark magic. She was the defense, her blades a near-impenetrable wall of steel that deflected and disabled any who came too close. He was the offense, his shadows lashing out to disarm, to entangle, to throw their enemies off balance, creating openings for her lethal strikes. They moved as one organism, a perfect fusion of mortal skill and immortal power. The courtiers who remained loyal to the crown, seeing their king finally roused to battle, took heart and joined the fray, turning the one-sided ambush into a desperate, swirling brawl. But Vorna's forces were numerous, and they were prepared. They pressed in, a relentless wave of steel. For every traitor they struck down, two more seemed to take their place. Kaelen felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in centuries, the strain of sustained combat. He was powerful, but his power had been a tool of intimidation and execution, not a weapon of war. He saw the opening a moment too late. A traitor, armed with a serrated silver dagger, slipped past his shadow wards while he was occupied with three others. The man lunged not at Kaelen, but at Rhys. She spun to meet him, her sword catching his dagger hand, but his momentum carried him forward. The blade, intended for her heart, slashed across her left forearm. Rhys cried out, a sharp, ragged gasp of pain. The sound cut through the din of battle and struck Kaelen like a physical blow. He turned and saw her stumble back a step, her face pale, a dark line of blood welling up on her arm, soaking the sleeve of her uniform. The sight of it, her blood, her pain, shed in his name, on his floor, broke something inside him. The last vestiges of the bored, theatrical monarch, the player of games, the connoisseur of ennui, burned away in a flash of pure, incandescent fury. The games were over. The shift was not gradual. It was a cataclysm. The ambient temperature in the great hall plummeted, a wave of unnatural cold washing over the battle. The remaining candlelight didn't just flicker, it was snuffed out, consumed by an encroaching darkness that was not a mere absence of light, but a tangible, hungry presence. The very shadows in the room deepened, stretching and twisting into monstrous shapes. They detached from the walls and pillars, coalescing around Kaelen like a living cloak. His eyes, which had been the color of aged blood, now blazed with a cold, terrifying crimson light that cut through the gloom. A low hum of raw power filled the air, a sound that resonated in the bones and teeth of every being in the room, mortal and immortal alike. This was not the subtle, controlled magic he used for convenience or intimidation. This was the ancient, untamed power that had carved out his kingdom from the primordial darkness, the power that had made armies of his own kind kneel in terror. This was the reason he was king. He moved, and he was no longer a man walking, but a force of nature flowing. The darkness moved with him, a suffocating, crushing wave. He didn't touch his enemies. He didn't need to. A vampire lunging at him with a sword suddenly screamed as his own shadow rose up, solidified, and wrenched the weapon from his grasp before slamming him into a wall with bone-shattering force. A group of 3 traitors advancing on Rhys found themselves frozen in place, their limbs locked tight by tendrils of darkness as solid as iron. He was no longer fighting to win. He was fighting to protect her. Every surge of his power was calculated to create a perimeter around Rhys, a sanctuary of absolute safety in the heart of the chaos. He cleared a path for her, not by striking down her opponents, but by simply removing them, casting them aside like dolls. The traitors, who had prepared to fight a king, found themselves facing a god of shadows, an elemental force of despair. Their courage, born of ambition and Vorna's promises, shattered against the wall of his absolute power. They began to fall back, terror replacing their bloodlust. Rhys stared, her breath catching in her throat. She had guarded him, challenged him, thought she had begun to understand him. She had been a fool. She had been guarding a slumbering volcano, and she had only ever seen the quiet plume of smoke at its peak. Now, she was witnessing the full, terrifying eruption, and it was all being unleashed on her behalf. The sheer scale of it was humbling, awe-inspiring, and utterly terrifying. The king she had called an idiot was remaking the laws of physics to keep her safe. The battle dissolved into a rout. Vorna's loyalists threw down their weapons, falling to their knees, paralyzed by the overwhelming pressure of his aura. Soon, only one was left standing, Vorna herself. She stood amidst the wreckage of her ambition, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. Kaelen glided toward her, the shadows swirling at his feet. "You were my advisor for 7 centuries, Vorna," he said, his voice no longer human, but a chorus of echoes, the sound of stone grinding against stone in the deep, silent places of the world. "You, of all people, should have known better. You grew weak," she spat, raising her sword, a last act of defiance. "You let a mortal bauble distract you from your duty." Kaelen didn't even look at her sword. He raised a hand, and the shadows around Vorna constricted, encasing her in a shell of impenetrable darkness. Her sword clattered to the floor. She screamed, a muffled, desperate sound from within the void. "My weakness is a more potent thing than your ambition could ever be," he said, his voice returning to a semblance of its normal tone, though edged with glacial cold. He did not kill her. Death was a gift, a release. He let the shadow cocoon sink into the obsidian floor, imprisoning her in a timeless, lightless void deep within the castle's foundations, a fate of eternal sensory deprivation. "You will have an eternity to reconsider the nature of duty." The message was absolute. The silence that followed was profound. The surviving guests, loyal and traitor alike, stared at him, their faces pale with a terror he had not inspired in centuries. The king was awake. The crimson light faded from his eyes. The oppressive darkness receded, leaving the great hall a ruin of overturned tables, shattered crystal, and fallen bodies. The fight was over. His power settled back into its deep well, leaving him standing in the center of the devastation. His gaze swept the room, but he saw none of it. He saw only her. Rhys was leaning against a pillar, her face etched with pain and exhaustion. She had a makeshift bandage tied around her bleeding arm, but it was already soaked through. He crossed the room in 3 silent strides, the world narrowing until she was the only thing in it. He reached her and, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for the being who had just commanded the shadows of hell, he took her injured hand. His cold, immortal fingers brushed against her warm, blood-slicked skin. The contrast was a physical shock to them both. He carefully unwrapped the crude bandage, his touch light as a moth's wing. The cut was deep, the silver in the blade having left an angry, searing line on her flesh. "Your contract with the crown," he said, his voice quiet, almost hoarse, "stipulates that it is rendered null and void should you sustain a permanent injury in the line of duty." He looked up from her wound, his eyes meeting hers. They were filled with a raw, ancient pain and a startling, profound vulnerability. "Your contract is fulfilled, Captain. You are free to go. The payment for your sister's care will be made in perpetuity. You have my word." She stared at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. All this power, all this rage, and now he was firing her. "You're letting me go," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I am," he said, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand, avoiding the wound. He didn't let go. "The position of captain of the Crimson Guard is clearly too dangerous. I cannot, in good conscience, allow you to continue in the role." He paused, his gaze holding hers, stripping away every last layer of artifice and power. He was just Kaelen, the man who had played foolish games to feel something, anything, and had found more than he had ever bargained for. However, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a soft, intimate murmur that was lost to the rest of the ruined hall. A new position has become available. The responsibilities are considerable. It requires endless vigilance, a cynical wit, and the patience to endure a monarch who is, on occasion, an idiot. He lifted her hand, the one that was not injured, and brushed his cold lips against her knuckles. The gesture was more binding than any contract, more sacred than any coronation. I am offering you a promotion, Rhys. I am offering you the throne beside mine. I am offering you the title of queen. Rhys's world tilted on its axis. The adrenaline from the fight, the shock of Vorna's betrayal, the terrifying spectacle of Kaelen's true power, it all receded, leaving only this impossible moment. The King of Shadows, the ancient being who had just entombed his oldest advisor in living darkness, was holding her hand like it was a fragile, priceless artifact and offering her a crown. Her mind struggled to connect the terrifying force of nature from moments ago with the man before her, whose eyes held a desperate, hopeful plea. She looked from his face to the devastation around them. The shattered remnants of the masquerade, the cowed and terrified survivors, the silent bodies of the fallen. This was his world. A world of eternal intrigue, of violence that was as beautiful as it was deadly. To be his queen was not to wear jewels and sit on a throne, it was to stand in the heart of this magnificent, dangerous storm. Forever. Her training, her instincts, her every cynical fiber screamed at her to run. To take his offer of freedom and gold and disappear back into the mortal world, to her sister, to a life where the dangers were simple things like fevers and bandits, not 700-year-old betrayals. But then she looked at him again. She saw past the power and the myth. She saw the profound, soul-deep loneliness he had tried to mask with boredom and theatrical games. She saw the man who had memorized the story of her scar and worried about her sister. She remembered the startling peace of being in his arms during the waltz, a quiet center in a swirling universe. He was offering her a throne, but what he was asking for was something far more terrifying and far more precious. He was asking her not to leave him alone in his eternity. Her voice, when she found it, was rough. "You're insane," she breathed. A flicker of something, fear, perhaps, crossed his face. "That has been said before." A promotion, she continued, a note of her old, defiant sarcasm creeping back into her tone, a familiar armor in an unfamiliar world. "And what does being queen entail? More chasing after an idiot who thinks ancient death traps are a spectator sport?" The tension in his shoulders eased. The desperate hope in his eyes was joined by a flash of the familiar, amused admiration she knew so well. A smile, a true and genuine smile that had nothing to do with games or irony, transformed his face. It was like watching a sunrise after 1,000 years of night. It lit him from within, chasing away the ancient shadows and revealing the man beneath the monarch. "No," he said, his voice soft, yet carrying the weight of a vow. "It means I'll have someone to stop me." He squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her skin. "It means I'll have a reason to be careful. To be better." He leaned in closer, his forehead resting against hers for a moment, an act of profound surrender. "It's never, ever boring with you, Rhys." That was the truth, wasn't it? Her life before this had been a series of duties, of hardships endured for the sake of another. Here, in this madhouse of ancient predators and gothic shadows, she had felt more alive, more challenged, more herself than ever before. He hadn't just woken up from his boredom, he had woken her from her own quiet, dutiful slumber. She did not give him a formal yes. Words were too small for the magnitude of the choice. Instead, she looked down at their joined hands, his, pale and cold and powerful, hers, scarred and warm and mortal, and tightened her grip. It was an answer, an acceptance, a promise. A new chapter began, not with a proclamation, but with that quiet, binding gesture. In the months that followed, the court was rebuilt, not just physically, but fundamentally. The stagnant air of centuries was swept away by a fresh, bracing wind. The whispers in the shadows were replaced by a new kind of respect, one born not just of fear, but of awe for the king who had been roused, and for the mortal woman who had roused him. Rhys never wore a crown, not in the traditional sense. Her crown was the twin silver-laced blades that were never far from her side, and the unwavering, intelligent authority in her eyes. She stood beside Kaelen on the dais, not behind him, a partner, not a consort. Her pragmatism tempered his theatricality. Her mortality gave his eternity a focus, an anchor in the flowing river of time. He taught her the intricate dance of immortal politics, and she taught him the simple, profound beauty of a single, finite sunrise. His games were gone, replaced by a genuine, shared life. There were still moments of friction, of course. He would occasionally slip into his old, dramatic habits, and she would meet them with a raised eyebrow and a dry comment that could cut glass. But the friction was the spark that kept their world bright. One evening, years later, they stood together in the observatory, watching a comet streak across the velvet darkness. His arm was around her, her head resting on his shoulder. The silence between them was comfortable, complete. "Are you bored?" she asked quietly. He turned his head, his lips brushing against her hair. The scent of her was still the most intoxicating thing in his world. He thought of the long, grey, featureless expanse of his life before her, that great, placid lake of ennui. And he thought of the vibrant, challenging, endlessly fascinating world she had built with him. "No," he whispered, his voice filled with a wonder that was still new, even after all this time. "Never. It's never, ever boring." For the first time in 1,000 years, the Vampire King was not waiting for his eternity to end. He was living it. He was, in fact, terrifyingly, wonderfully alive.